Margaret Atwood is one of the leading, most popular and most celebrated English language authors in the world today. She was born in Ottawa, Canada in 1939, and her output since has been not only vast but also extremely wide-ranging, both in topic and in genre. She's so far published more than 40 books, and these range from poems to novels to short stories to essays and to works of literary criticism. And she also moves quite widely within these genres as well. In fact, she's often pressing the boundaries of genres to see how far she can take them. And so of those 40 books or so that I mentioned, these can take the form of realist historical fiction, of science fiction, of fantasy, of horror, and so on. So she's obviously an author very interested in genre and what the different genres have to offer. So it's always worth bearing that in mind when we're reading and trying to make sense of any of her individual works. The story of Margaret Atwood's we have on our reading list, Elfinland, comes from the collection Stone Mattress, subtitled 9 Wicked Tales, which was published as recently as 2014. You may be interested to hear that the title piece from this collection, Stone Mattress, was composed by Atwood whilst she was on a boat in the Arctic, and her fellow passengers challenged her to write a murder mystery story about how you might be able to commit a murder on such a boat. So that's how it all started off. Now, these are 9 separate stories. Most of them don't have anything obvious to do with each other, but that's actually not quite true of the first 3. So if you enjoy the story we have on our reading list, Elfinland, you may want to read further into the collection because the next 2 stories are related to it. The figure who binds these 3 stories together is Gavin the poet, Constance's early live-in lover. In the second story we see him living with his 3rd wife, Reynolds, and it seems that at the end of this story he dies. And he's certainly dead by the 3rd story because this takes the point of view of Margaret, the woman with whom he had a fling whilst he was supposed to be with Constance. And she reads about Gavin's death, attends his funeral, and there she meets Constance again. So there is an intertwining of the first 3 stories. So as I said, if you enjoy Elfinland, there is more if you would like to read further. Now, I said that Margaret Atwood likes to write in a variety of different genres. And just as wide-ranging as her choice of genre is her choice of topic. She's certainly not an author that we would want to limit to 1 or 2 particular themes. Having said that, though, women and gender are recurring themes in several of her works, including some of her most important. I place the titles of 2 of her most famous and widely read novels on the screen here. The Handmaid's Tale from 1985 and Alias Grace from 1996, and both of these are very focused on the issue of women and gender. The Handmaid's Tale is actually a work of science fiction. It's set in the not too distant future because it remembers the period of the 1980s and I suppose the end of the 1970s as well. So it's very much bound up with contemporary realities, as science fiction often is. But there's been a reaction to the very permissive society that came to exist in North America in the 1980s. And as a consequence of this, there's been a sort of religious theocracy has taken over, and it's very, very male-dominated. And as a result, you end up with 2 kinds of women, two roles for women. One is to be a wife, which is purely a status symbol, and the other one is to be a breeder, because like many dystopian science fiction novels, there's a danger of the race running out. There seems to be a lack of reproductivity. So these handmaids are kept in this house. They belong to a man. They even take his name. The main character in this one is called Offred, which is of Fred. Had your man be called Stephen, you'll be called of Stephen, and so on. And her purpose is purely to breed on behalf of the wife. She does get sent out for a few tasks from time to time, but then she has to wear lots of clothing which blocks even her line of vision. She's only allowed to go to certain places, and she's only allowed to see certain things. And she lives in a room that is very, very small and very, very bare. So it's a very vivid enactment of the kind of thing we find in Virginia Woolf, this coordination between women's experience and the rooms that they live in. So that's The Handmaid's Tale, science fiction, as I said. Alias Grace, 10 years later, is a realistic historical novel. It's actually based on a true story from, I think, 1846, in which a servant girl murders the man in whose house she works. It's based on a true story, and it explores this girl's culpability. To what extent is she blamed for performing the act that she performs? And of course, there's a very strong focus again on the limitations of the life that this girl has to lead. So it's very much on the issue of what are women's choices, what are their freedoms, how culpable can they then be made for the choices that they make. So as my very brief overview of those two novels hopefully has suggested, there are a lot of things you could say that Margaret Atwood's writing has in common with Virginia Woolf. And so without wanting to suggest that Atwood is purely following in Virginia Woolf's footsteps or taking Virginia Woolf's ideas, that's not my point. But I do think that what we can do is ask similar questions of each of their writings and look at how they handle similar themes and use similar storytelling techniques. One of them, of course, being this business of the room and of space. So what I want you to do when this video finishes is, before you continue to listen to the rest of the lesson, try to think about what happens if you read Margaret Atwood's short story Alfinland from a gender perspective, particularly if you focus on the kind of issues that Virginia Woolf raises in her writings. Above all, I want you to try to answer for yourself the question, how do you think gender itself is presented in this story? And how has the fact that she is a woman affected Constance's life generally, but more specifically her life as a writer? What, if anything, does this story have to say about the relationship between gender and literature? In the written part of the lesson I've put those questions down. I've also given you 3 more explicit questions which I will seek to address in some sound files. First of all, how is communication between men and women presented in this story? Second, how is gender represented or enacted spatially? And finally, what do you think is the relationship between gender and writing as it's presented in this story?